Well, hello, everyone. I'm Nancy Netzer, the inaugural Robert L. and Judith T. Winston Director of the McMullen Museum and Professor of Art History in the Department of Art, Art History, and Film at Boston College. I welcome all of you to the second in our fall series of book presentations by faculty in our Department of Art, Art History, and Film. This evening, I have the honor and great pleasure of introducing our speaker, a celebrated scholar and a new member of our department, Professor Kevin Lotery. Professor Lotery received his PhD in modern art at Harvard University in 2015. Before coming to Boston College, he was lecturer in the Fine Art Department at Newcastle University in England. Previously, he taught at Sarah Lawrence College and the New School and at Columbia University as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow. A specialist in modern and contemporary art in Europe and the Americas, Professor Lotery focuses his scholarly inquiry on interactions between art, architecture, and forms of technological and philosophical research. He has a long list of articles on modern artists, including Robert Morris, Tacita Dean, and Richard Hamilton. And his research has been supported by grants from the Hauser and Wirth Institute, the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art, the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies, and the Institute for Historical Research at the University of London. He's currently working on a new book that examines utopian imaginaries within the world and writing of a number of emigre Jewish artists, writers, and filmmakers after World War II. And he began this avenue of inquiry, in his words, quote, in part as a response to the rise of neo-fascisms and the xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-LGBTQ violence that buttress them. This evening, he will speak to us about his book, The Long Front of Culture, the Independent Group and Exhibition Design, recently published by the MIT Press. In the book, he examines collaborative exhibition design projects of what he characterizes, or by what he characterizes as an unruly group of artists, architects, curators, and writers in 1950s Britain. Now he'll speak for about 40 minutes and then we'll take questions. I ask you please to mute your microphones now and to keep them muted during the lecture. If you have a question while Professor Lotery is speaking, you can write it to me in the chat. So without further ado, I'll ask you all to join me in congratulating Professor Lotery on his new book as I invite him to take over the screen.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Let me just share my screen. Everyone see that? Yeah. Yep. Cool. Yeah, thank you to the whole crew at the McMullen. Nancy, thank you for that wonderful and generous introduction. Rachel and Diana as well. I'm really grateful for this platform to share my work with you all. And thanks also to my department, all the members of my department who are and aren't with us right now on the Zoom. You've welcomed me so warmly into the BC community during such a strange and in many ways cruel time, and it has meant a lot to me. And finally, thanks to my students for joining right now. Look forward to talking to you in class in 2 days. Okay, so I've prepared a talk of, it's gonna be a little bit over 40 minutes. I hope not more than a couple minutes over. And I'll take you through some of the major arguments of the book, which you see the cover here on the screen. And here's, actually, I'm not sharing that, but this is the book, if you can see my little face. I'll take you through some of the major arguments of the book. by looking closely at some of the exhibition projects I look at in the chapters. And I thought I'd show you a lot of images. So if you have any questions, or if I move through anything too quickly, or I leave things underexplained, I'm happy to return to anything in the question and answer period. But before getting to the meat of the book, I thought I'd set the scene a little bit. And we need to have, first and foremost, something of an idea of what the independent group was. Like, who were the members, why and how they came together as a group, and in what context they came together. That is, the context of post-war Britain. Though its members had been in contact as early as the late 1940s, the independent group, or the IG as we'll call them, met formally for the first time in 1952 at London's Institute of Contemporary Arts, or the ICA, the group's base of operations for the next several years. Key members included, and you see some of these super cool members here. Key members included critic and curator Lawrence Alloway, architectural historian Rainer Banham, curator Tony Del Renzio, artist Richard Hamilton, you see him on the left, photographer Nigel Henderson, technologist John McHale, architects Allison and Peter Smithson on the right, and sculptors Eduardo Paolazzi and William Turnbull. Some of these figures, like Paolazzi and Henderson, had been art school friends prior to the formation of the IG, and had traveled, in their case, to Paris to meet surviving members of the avant-garde in the late 1940s. Others, like the Smithsons, were partners in work and life, and still others, like Hamilton, were attempting to assimilate artistic skills that they had gained in art school with the technical skills learned in a variety of wartime roles. In many ways, this was a random assortment, an unruly group, as Nancy said. All they really shared was their youth, the fact that their careers were interrupted by the war, and the fact that they hung out occasionally at the newly founded ICA, which was devoted, as it is now still, to the art of the immediate present. When the ICA offered a time slot for a group of young British contemporary artists then, these were the figures that turned up, bringing with them their friends. But by the time of their first official meeting in 1952, many had already begun to ponder the question that would occupy them in the coming years. What, they asked in different ways, would the artist have to become in order to face up to what they saw as the new conditions of a post-war order? And these included, very broadly, first, a traumatized world devastated by the bombs of the Blitz, the Allied bombing raids on the continent, or Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Second, a destroyed and exiled pre-war avant-garde culture that now had to be recollected and reimagined after the war. And thirdly, an American century, or a looming American century in which the law of the commodity and the spectacle, proffered by the ad man on Madison Avenue, was getting busy offering new configurations of desire, violence, domesticity, and technologically aided pleasure. So I want to be clear on this context, because it's quite different. It's a quite different world from the one we know from images of 1950s America. As you can see on the right a little bit in the fantastic photo, which is like a rock album cover before rock album covers, London was a gray, austere world pockmarked by bomb sites and rubble, and still into the mid-1950s subsisting under rationing and austerity measures. From that vantage, from the vantage of that world, the glossy, colorful world of American consumer culture that was seeking to go global at that very moment looked bright, happy, even utopian, offering ephemeral pleasures beyond what anyone in the UK or on the continent had yet experienced. The IG was poised between these two worlds, which made it perfectly placed to intervene in both. The members brought drastically different experiences, priorities, and interests to the group. And in their meetings, which were by turns debates, demonstrations, lectures, and arguments, research topics seemed to include everything: biological theory, cybernetics and game theory, cinema spectacle, advertising technique, technologies of design and car styling, and of course, Marcel Duchamp. They took on, in short, the military industrial forces that were then moving from the battlefield to the home, shop, and factory in order to restructure culture at large. And they situated art, that most refined and elite form of aesthetic production, right in the midst of it all. No more privileged an activity than the streamlining of a helicopter blade or the projection technology of the Hollywood Dream Factory. With such expansive forms of technology and pleasure in play, they felt, culture could no longer be considered a hierarchical pyramidal structure with art at the top. It was now a horizontal field, what Alloway later termed the continuum, or the long front of culture, which I've taken for the title of my book. Facing up to these massive and seductive forms of culture, art, they reasoned, had better adapt or face extinction. The IG did adapt, and what its members produced reflected more than simply a naive proto-pop adoration of the pleasures of the long front of culture. Their goal, I think, was to invent new participatory forms of research and intervention, new aesthetic techniques capable of reconstellating, even redesigning 1950s culture at large. By integrating some of post-war culture's most sinister and exciting forces, they hope to redirect technological and consumerist fantasies and affects to free them from the principle of ownership, for example, and take them elsewhere to an undesigned future. We see this in many of the members' individual projects produced in and around the IG. Take, for example, Nigel Henderson's para-architectural screen, which I've shown here. Somewhere between collage, architectural element, archive, and display apparatus, screen is composed of 4 distinct wooden panels, at least 2 of which were repurposed French doors. The work was positioned in Henderson's studio for much of the 1950s, where it functioned as a kind of working, what he called a tack board, or what we would call today like a mood board, for images that interested him and that he wanted to have on hand for his ongoing studio work. And on the right, we can see it.
Kevin, are you there?
American advertisements, packaging, technical and scientific journals, pornographic magazines, art historical books, all the things, in other words, that made up the long front. And I love this work. There's so much more to say about it. It's really understudied. But particularly the cheeky, kind of sneaky passages like in the top left, where you see this kind of Jackson Pollock handprint come headdress, or the bottom, or actually throughout the whole work, where you see this kind of playfulness in regards to the construction of gender. You can see that's very much on his mind. Others in the IG too, Palazzi and Hamilton especially, would also seek to understand how the body's most intimate zones of sensory pleasure and communication were in the process of being reprogrammed with new desires. What, the IG asked, were the post-war gender constructions that the new shiny commodities and glossies from across the pond were calling for, even implanting in us? What types of desires were they programming in us? And how might the artist intervene in and reprogram them before they took root? While these and other individual projects were crucial to the IG's researches, and they're crucial to my thinking, my book takes a different tack. It sort of decenters a little bit. It argues that exhibition design was, in fact, the most essential form the IG turned to. And in the roughly 10-year period of experimentation that the group undertook at the ICA and elsewhere, the IG and select collaborators reinvented the medium in multiple ways. It's my book's ambition to unpack some of the group's most lasting findings and bring them into our present. To do so, it moves chronologically through the roughly 10 years of exhibition design experimentation that the IG and its affiliates undertook from about 1951 to 59. Each chapter takes as its subject one exhibition. So while the book is tightly focused on the specific social and formal conditions of each of these projects in post-war Britain, it also has grander aims, namely to offer a theory of exhibition design as an artistic technique with, as Hamilton put it, unique properties all its own. Take, for example, Hamilton's Man, Machine, and Motion, first mounted at the Hatton Gallery in Newcastle before traveling to the ICA in London. The exhibition consisted, as you can see here, of steel display frames clipped together via a system that Hamilton himself invented and fabricated and then published. In fact, here's the diagram of the system, publishing it in an architectural trade journal. This armature supported enlarged photographs and drawings of what Hamilton termed, and I love this term, adaptive appliances, man-made technical prostheses aimed at expanding the motion and speed of the human body. Crucial to the IG's researches, these objects ranged from the archaic and the mythic to the military industrial. Daedalus's waxen wings and Leonardo's flying machines could be found next to contemporary helicopters, cars, motorcycles, and scuba gear. Hamilton called these appliances the essential material of history, technologies of speed and motion that yoked the body to new rhythms and speeds of time itself. And he also called them instruments of fantasy and dream, machines for implementing the impossible fantasies of flight, underwater subsistence, or space travel. These were the machines for the production of fantasy, in other words. And the goal was to insert the spectator into the production process of fantasy itself. This was implemented in a number of ways. Sorry. Hamilton paired photographic reproductions with blank white panels. You can see it in all of these images. I'll just sort of flicker back and forth. He also left negative space between panels. You can see that strongly in the left image, so that some frames remained empty, enclosing nothing but physical space. These gaps granted a more active role to the spectator, such that each movement could reconstellate the images into moving ensembles of image, architecture, and body. It's something you really see on the left. This then might be seen as a space not only of photographic comparison, but of technological assembly and machinic coupling, as each spectatorial movement not only produced new image permutations, but also new hybrids assembled from adaptive appliances that would never otherwise share the same space, like sci-fi spacesuits you see on near the ceiling, early planes like the Wright brothers planes, or bicycles. Even more, the gaps and hollows of the design meant that spectators were incorporated into the space of the display as exhibited material and potential operators of these new impossible technological prostheses. Thus, while the gaps transformed spectators into potential producers of technical implements, crossing scuba gear and aeronautical equipment, for example, they also incorporated the actual bodies of spectators into these heterogeneous prototypes, generating ever-changing moving image constellations, mixing display lattice, image, and the bodies of other spectators. Love these images. The exhibition then was an adaptive appliance of its own, a kind of intermedia motion machine, harnessing the motion of the spectator's body to generate shifting kinetic assemblies of wearable machine prototypes. Man-Machine in Motion shows a crucial aim of the IG's turn to exhibition design. They found in it not only a way to deprivilege the space of art by flooding it with images of science, technology, and popular culture, it was also far more profound. Their goal was to transform the givens of spectatorship, walking, looking, posing, bending, into creative acts of design and imagination. In other words, engines for the production of fantasy and for the generation of the impossible, the unforeseen, the new, in short. Exhibition design, they realized, was uniquely equipped to activate the spectator in the creation of aesthetic experiences that were not yet programmed by mass cultural forces. For this and many other reasons, exhibition design was, I argue, the motor of the IG, and the group reinvented the medium in multiple ways. And I'm just showing you a couple images of the group making exhibitions so you have a sense of the work entailed. In addition to exploring their specific projects then, my book looks to theorize a more cross-disciplinary understanding of the 1950s, one that has less to do with New York school painting or proto-pop painting and its vicissitudes, but rather with the origins of our cross-disciplinary, curatorial, and research-obsessed present. So exhibition design was the central medium of the IG for several more reasons. Dependent on the knowledge and know-how of multiple disciplines, practitioners, and technicians, exhibition design, IG members understood, was an essentially collaborative medium. And as such, it set the scene for the collective work of the IG. It was, practically speaking, the only medium that allowed them to make things together and to test different working groups amongst the many members. The collaborative work of researching and making, undertaken in Parallel of Life and Art, say, on the left, or This is Tomorrow on the right, we'll look at both in a minute, allowed for Hamilton, Henderson, Palazzi, the Smithsons, and all the others to learn who they were as individuals and as a group. In doing so, they turned the labors of exhibition making, research, discussion, debate, planning, publicity, into aesthetic acts, opportunities to fashion shifting group identities. As an ethos and as a group then, the IG was made in exhibition. The turn to exhibition, to the exhibition form was formally, historically, and politically strategic too. It was an intervention in a signature, though still underappreciated, technique of the interwar avant-gardes, that is the avant-gardes between the First and Second World Wars, even of modernity in general, one that was as integral to the history of the commodity as to the history of art, science, and technology. From the interwar thinkers closest to the theory and practice of exhibition making, including people like Siegfried Gideon, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Alexander Dorner, as well as major innovators like El Lissitzky, we see one of his projects on the left, or Marcel Duchamp, IG members came to realize that exhibition design was the only aesthetic technique that could accommodate the full range of cultural activities that made up the long front of post-war culture. And I'm just showing you two projects, one by Lissitzky on the left and one by Duchamp, which are super complicated, but for those of us who study the history of artist design exhibitions, they're perhaps the two most foundational of that period. And in both projects, the activation, even the disorientation of the spectator was absolutely central to the design. And this is a trait that the IG would take forward. And as we could already sense in Man, Machine, and Motion, for example, the IG took their cues from a flourishing and decidedly global mid-century culture of exhibition making, exemplified, for example, by the work of Charles and Ray Eames. Transcending high-low divisions, exhibition making was seen then as a truly cross-disciplinary and decidedly popular medium for producing traveling aesthetic experiences. It was a form operative in advanced art, design, education, architecture, and consumer culture alike. And unlike the more traditional mediums, it promised synthesis of the separate arts of painting, architecture, sculpture, typography, film, and design, but also synthesis of the separate fields of culture, science, technology, and consumption. The Bauhaus exhibition design guru Herbert Bayer was clear on this point as early as 1939, calling exhibition design, quote, the apex of all collective effects, of all powers of design, unquote. By the 1950s, the discourse was guided by mid-century polymaths like the Eameses, maybe most of all, but also Alexander Girard, Georgi Kepes, down the road at MIT, Max Bill, Edward Steichen, and in the UK, Misha Black. In their hands, exhibition design had become one of the most active fields of aesthetic inquiry and visual communication of the decade. And this is really lost when we obsess on abstract expressionist painting at the expense of these cross-disciplinary forms. Cognizant of both the avant-gardist and consumerist strains of display technology, the IG was at the forefront of exhibition research. No other form, they realized, could assimilate, display, and critically reorganize technologies and materials drawn from all spaces of culture, gallery, factory, laboratory, office, studio, street, cinema, television, domestic interior, and make the body contend with a reconfiguration of them all in real space and time. Misha Black, the British emigre design guru, who spearheaded the Festival of Britain, which we see on the left, and which was, in short, just a massive exhibition on London's South Bank that sought to sort of show to the public British efforts to rebuild via technology, science, and agriculture. Misha Black, who was really at the core of this project, put it succinctly in 1950, very much from the mindset of post-war reconstruction. The role of the exhibition designer, he wrote, was to create display devices that, quote, sell something, whether it is a new line of teapots or a plan for the regeneration of Western civilization, unquote. Pretty modest aims. And as Black and the IG understood, exhibition design as an essentially ephemeral, movable display technology could integrate to other forms of moving image and text-based technologies like cinema, television, typewriters, like on the right here, automobiles, and store display. The IG fashioned their group identity within this kind of post-war ethos. And like Black, they soon began to understand exhibition design as, to quote Hamilton again, a form in its own right with unique properties. Beginning with Growth and Form in 1951, we see IG members meditating on the exhibition form as an interface for testing new cross-disciplinary connections, and by extension, for formulating new types of relationships between image, body, and architecture. Thus, their interests go far beyond the proto-pop embrace of mass culture that is often tacked to them, as if they're only the progenitors of pop art or the founders of pop art. Beneath their themes, biology, the history of technology, anthropology, mass media, science fiction, consumer desire, lies a deep engagement with the core wiring of cognition and imagination, and with philosophies of temporality and creation. Psychology, empiricism, artistic creation, contact, sensation, these are the terms they query. So when, for example, Hamilton took on biological morphogenesis or biological theory in Growth and Form, the first exhibition chronicled in my book, he found himself wrestling with the relations between what he called the physical laws of natural growth and the more messy psychological processes of artistic creation. He noted early on that art, with its psychological complexities and morphological theory, where biology, chemistry, physics, and mathematics overlap, might resist easy cross-disciplinary synthesis. They might, in fact, be what he said, quite contrary to one another. But their contrariness was the point, I think, and Hamilton found generative potential in the impossibility of synthesizing art and science. Starting with Growth and Form, he turned to the exhibition form to design provisional zones of interchange, where distinct fields might share vital impulses, where different forms of thought might share in their contrariness. It was this contrariness, he felt, that pointed to the borders of the thinkable and the imaginable, the natural habitat, in other words, of artistic creation. The display apparatuses he invented for Growth and Form, and so crucial to IG exhibition design going forward, and I spent a great deal of time on them in the book. These apparatuses, and I'm just showing one here, place the spectator at the center of this nexus of forces. We see it here in this white grid display structure. We can see different angles on the structure. It's this white grid at the bottom left you see, and we can see it from far away and then right in the midst of it on the right. In the white grid display structure that Hamilton used to exhibit examples of radiolaria, marine microorganisms whose geometric skeletal structures fascinated naturalists from Ernst Haeckel to Darcy Wentworth Thompson. This, I think, was more than a static display structure. It was instead a kind of image-generating media apparatus with mirrored panels and bare panels that caught shadows and reflections. It was a media apparatus which spectators could move around and even enter, as you can see on the top left, creating as they move ever-changing constellations of image, shadow, reflection, diagram, and architecture. Such hybrid constructions, they're more like technologies to me, this grid, also produced impossible creatures piecing together human, animal, and microorganism. The goal, once again, was to transform banal acts of walking and looking into imaginative acts of design, capable of fusing diagram and model, specimen and photographic reproduction. Hamilton's was the darkened space of vital originary growth, where new composite forms of imagination might be fabricated by spectator designers. But it wasn't all fun and games. And post-war imagination, Hamilton implied, would have to be tinged with wartime traumas of the Blitz, of fascism. It is no accident that this area of Growth and Form resembled another key work of exhibition making, Picasso's transportable mural painting Guernica, painted for the Spanish Republic's Pavilion at the 1937 International Exposition in Paris. As I'm sure many of you know, The work presents an allegorical tableau of the firebombing of the village of Guernica, undertaken by German bombers on behalf of the Franco regime earlier that year. After its initial appearance in Paris, the work subsequently traveled throughout Europe and the United States. It even was shown at the Fogg Museum. In 1938, at the behest of ICA founder Roland Penrose, it visited Whitechapel Art Gallery in East London. And the same year, it also hung in the new Burlington Galleries near Ryman Studios, the design office where the teenaged Hamilton was then learning the exhibition design trade. Hamilton later recounted visiting the painting at Burlington Galleries on the advice of his Ryman mentor, Professor Haas Hai, who was a German emigre fleeing the Nazis. Hamilton described it as a lifetime experience. 10 years on, amidst the wreckage of a bombed out London, the memory of this visit might have rhymed with a post-war world that urgently needed its own contemporary images of historical trauma on the level of Picasso's allegoric memorial, but within a new regime of military industrial reconstruction. For a public still living amidst the traces of war, Hamilton's setup provided opportunities for constructing precarious memory images that could partake of the new materials and protagonists of mnemonic representation, the minute passing reflections and shadows of traumatized, anesthetized organisms suspended within an endlessly reflective grid, not unlike the new corporate spaces soon to migrate from across the pond. These are clearly not the animals of Picasso's allegory of bombing. They have been replaced by clinically dissected specimens, splitting and doubling within the reflective walls of their cubicles. Alongside fantastical biotechnical visions then, nightmarish dispersals, those of the Blitz, Hiroshima, or of coming Cold War forces, haunt Hamilton's assemblages. Henderson, who helped Hamilton conceptualize growth and form, also prioritized new forms of aesthetic imagination over the IG's more superficial embrace of mass cultural materials. After he, Palazzi, the Smithsons, and mounted the photographic exhibition Parallel of Life and Art, you can see it here, as a response to growth and form, Henderson lectured vociferously on the group's commitment to a form of collaborative empiricism, which he feared had been missed or lost by the title that the group decided upon. Rather than present a predetermined meaning or statement on the fusion of life and art, Henderson affirmed that the team proceeded empirically. That was his words. Guiding this spider's web, and that's what Henderson called this strung up photographic exhibition. I love that term, spider's web. Guiding it was a critical interrogation of the core methodologies of knowledge production and experimentation. In undertaking this experiment, the team gathered everything possible that they were drawn to. Remember, screen from the beginning of the lecture. Photographs drawn from every discipline and field, including art by the likes of Jean Dubuffet, Kandinsky, or Pollock, anthropology, masks, fetish objects, language systems, and biology, cross-sections, microphotographs, X-ray photographs. This was the long front materialized. And if art was to face up to it, a new working aesthetic, as Henderson called it, or as I call it, a new empiricism would have to be formulated. For Henderson and Hamilton both, this reworking of the core methods of cross-disciplinary experimentation often led to a kind of vitalist approach, one that sought to share energies between seemingly distinct organisms, technologies, and images. Thus, we often see them wrapping the human spectator into webs or vital fields of images, models, or structures, as if to diagram the anatomy of the human subject together with technological materials. a reanimated creative organism might result, an arachnoid builder capable of catching bodies, images, technical materials, and architectural spaces in its web. And it's no coincidence then that IG members often photograph the body, remember the growth and form images as well, that they often photograph the body of the visitor or of the designer, him or herself, in this case, fully enmeshed within display apparatuses, as in Henderson's punning portrait of Peter Smithson's body rhyming with anatomical diagrams on display behind him. You can see that in top left. Such images capture the cheeky optimism of the IG's approach to an exhibition of the long front of culture. They also evince the pleasures the IG sought in the production of the not yet imagined. Today, we might call this affirmative take on the long front, sort of from our internet, from our position and living within the web of the internet. We might call it rhizomatic, a decentered, sprawling approach to the full network of cultural products. Henderson called it empirical, an activity that ran parallel to Gilles Deleuze's articulation of a critical empiricism, which he actually formulated in the early 1950s. And Deleuze describes as, quote, a search for the conditions under which something new is produced, unquote. This was no mere positivism then, no mere fascination with the pleasures of the cultural continuum as they exist, but rather a continuation of that most vanguard endeavor, the production, even affirmation of the new. With the advent of a 1950s consumer culture that advertised the brand new or the new and improved in the sheen of the commodity surface or the advertised image, the idea of the new, it seemed to the IG, was under threat. Reclaiming it from the repetitive cycles of consumption was a fresh and urgent task. However, the IG's non-judgmental approach, their acceptance in a way, to the long front of culture led the group not to critique the commodity's false claims on the new, but to redirect its energies, to collaborate with the technological forces conditioning it. This ethos is there in some of the IG's most famous works, and in this case, no doubt, their most famous work. And if you've ever looked or seen or thought about the IG, you've probably seen this work. Many people consider it like the first work of pop art. It's much more complicated than that, of course. So it's there in some of their most famous individual works, but it's also there in some of the lesser known works, like Henderson's photographs, earliest photographs, which show us both the specter of American global capitalism encroaching on Bethnal Green streets. See the comic books and products in the newsagent on the left, showing how the reach of American consumer culture was encroaching. Alongside children making do within the grim post-war streets of East London. For Henderson, the child's improvised forms of play and imagination, which worked with the givens of the street, dirt, trash, bomb detritus, pavement. The child could imagine new topsy-turvy bodily comportments, new subjectivities even, in the face of the technology of the camera itself. IG members encourage this childlike approach in The Spectator too, turning to exhibition design to stage new types of partnerships, collaborations, and collectivities between things, images, and beings. Theirs was a pop approach to collectivity, quite different from the avant-garde exhibition designers of the interwar period. As Benjamin Buchloh has noted, those practitioners, El Lissitzky foremost among them, turned to exhibition design in order to replace atomized, individualized spectatorship with forms of simultaneous collective reception. That is, to replace the bourgeois individual with new types of collective subjectivity. At the dawn of global mass culture and its hypertrophic investment in the commoditized thing or the advertised image, the IG realized that a more expansive model of collectivity had to be enacted, one that could encompass things, images, and objects alongside human subjects. This is visible, for instance, in the topsy-turvy architecture of the funhouse structure at the massive exhibition, This Is Tomorrow. And the funhouse structure was designed by Richard Hamilton, McHale, and John Volcker. You can see Hamilton's perspective study on the left, as well as an installation view on the right. I'll show you a bunch of photographs of it. It's hard to sort of visualize, and it's quite confusing because it's a funhouse. Attached to one side, Hamilton produced a replica of the billboard for the major sci-fi film, American sci-fi film, Forbidden Planet. You can see that on the right. The group coupled this monstrous billboard image with other hints of violence and pleasure, which seemed to diminish the stature and centrality of the human body. We see that famous blow-up of Marilyn Monroe from the 7-year Itch on the right, released also that year in 1956. A reproduction of the National Gallery's prized Van Gogh Sunflowers. You can see it here. Cheeky, very cheeky. A gargantuan Guinness bottle. You can see it next to Marilyn. We'll have another view of that in a second. And a panorama of screen gods and goddesses. Inside, magazine images wallpapered canted surfaces. Strange voices sounded from some unknown source. Film clips projected across the space and onto walls. Duchampian rotoscope machines and optical illusion posters turned hypnotically without end. In the rear, a squishy linoleum floor adorned with a Jackson Pollock-like motif, this is my favorite part, emitted a strawberry scent when stepped on. Nearby, visitors were invited to speak into a microphone, connected to speakers placed at the other end of the structure. The result was a jarring dispersal of sound and image across the space, such that their sources, whether spectator, jukebox, film projector, could not be determined accurately. So I think that the funhouse should be seen less as a functioning architectural structure and more funhouse-like, like as a techno zone of fluid sensations and affects into which the spectator was to be technologically dispersed. This is signaled by the collage, for example, that we see on the left in the study as well as on the top right, that was at the entrance of the funhouse, which you see in this portrait of this man, each of his senses isolated. Look, smell, hear, touch. Each of the senses were to be targeted and dispersed synesthetically. No longer the privileged center of spatial construction. The human body would now have to scale itself or rescale itself, funhouse-like, to the proportions of its commercial overlords, whether Guinness bottle or billboard image. This openness, here's that Guinness bottle on the left in the foreground. This openness to the subjectivity of the commodity differentiates the IG starkly from later American popists like Andy Warhol. For Warhol, the commodity could be a weapon to throw at painting, a way to negate painting's privileged status. But the IG, in theorizing the very first model of pop, took a different tack. Theirs was not a project of Warholian negation, like a project of negating painting with the commodity, but it was one of affirmation, creation. And this uncomfortable fact is lost when the IG is folded into a story of American pop. In 1961, Hamilton would state it plainly. Rather than Dadaistic negation, which sought to negate both mass culture and fine art by merging them, think of Duchamp's ready-mades, or Warhol's soup cans, or his Coca-Cola bottles. Hamilton instead was engaged in what he called, quote, positive Dada, creative where Dada was destructive, unquote. Thus, when we encounter in This Is Tomorrow a Guinness bottle used not as iconographical content for a painting, as in Warhol's key early Coca-Cola paintings, but entering into the real space of the spectator, we have a completely different approach than the one canonized in American pop. One that greeted the thing, the object, the appliance, as a being within the same continuum as the human. What's more, these new beings, whether robot, bottle, or pinup, had already begun, it seemed to the IG, to rescale space according to their non-human imagination. A topsy-turvy scalar order that threatened to resize, reshape, rescale both gallery and living room and all spaces in between. And by the point of this collage, by this point in 1956, the IG was becoming hip to the grim machinations of the culture industry and its prescribed consumable roles of feminine passivity and masculinist mastery. And as this collage and the funhouse demonstrate, these could be tinged with both pleasure and violence. Still, and the gender politics on display in the IG's, both their individual projects and their collaborative exhibitions, is extremely complicated, and we could absolutely talk about that if we like later on. Still, the goal seemed to be to attempt to work with the pleasures and affects of these images, commodities, technologies, and to see if they could be rerouted towards other ends, right? Whether that is the thrill of the American pop song, or the cinema spectacle, or the commodity, could be decoupled from the regime of consumption and of ownership, and dispersed into unforeseen affects and desires. The final IG affiliated exhibitions of the decade, with the decidedly conceptual titles of An Exhibit, as we see here, and Exhibit 2, continued along this path, exploring the possibility of a future robot world given over to machinic processes of automation and self-regulation that maybe no longer needed the labor power of the human operator any longer. Using only a kit of standard units of perspex, what we call plexiglass in the States, Hamilton and his colleague at Newcastle University, Victor Passmore, mounted a purely abstract exhibition armature of the highly reflective sheets, suspended in different orientations and arrangements. You can see them here, producing an infinity of reflective details. The goal, as Hamilton stated, was to do, quote, an exhibition without any photographs or content, but only the panel system, and just treat it as purely an exhibition in its own right. The structure would be the exhibit, unquote. Thus, the project consisted of two maneuvers, and it's quite complicated, but just briefly, the two maneuvers. The withdrawal of all exhibition content, like no photographs, in favor of an infinitely hollow, empty exhibition structure exhibiting nothing but its own conditions of display. And also, the second maneuver, a playful, game-like overload of chance, effects, determined by the bodily movements of spectators amongst the reflective panels. Quote, the meaning of an exhibit is now dependent on the decisions of visitors, Lawrence Alloway wrote in the catalog. He continues, it is a game, a maze, a ceremony completed by the participation of the visitors, unquote. At a moment when the issue of chance production, whether in the studio, think of the drip paintings of Jackson Pollock, in Cold War discourses of cybernetics and game theory, or in the factory, where automation was a source of great fascination and dread. And in fact, it's sort of one of the plot points of Forbidden Planet, and exhibit tested in this moment whether chance and random affect could survive a world of refined automated standardization. In the process, the dematerialized display signaled the end, I would say, of IG exhibition design, while also in one stroke, presaging the tactics of minimalism and conceptual art of the next decade, both of which privileged the reception process of the spectator over and above the agency of the artist. But my book ends with a coda that jumps forward, and it deals with Hamilton's return to exhibition design in 1978. And I wanted to share this with you in part because of the other interests of my colleagues, also because I really like this project. Hamilton's return to exhibition design in 1978, when London's National Gallery invited him to participate in its artist-curated exhibition series, The Artist's Eye, asking him to select, curate, and design a space for objects drawn from the eminent museum's permanent collection. For his display, Hamilton selected works by Velázquez, Rembrandt, Bosch, Gainsborough, Poussin, and Sanderdam, including among them his own painting of Marilyn Monroe, of course, My Marilyn from 1965. He also included a subtle wink to the pop ethos of his IG days, inserting a reproduction of the the museum's prize sunflowers, which you can see here on the edge on the right, by Van Gogh, just like the one hanging in the funhouse 20 years earlier. We also have this wicker chair. Other pop implements and Duchampian ready-mades found themselves in the artist's eye alongside more domestic comforts. A working television set, mirror, ironing board, Eames armchair, Persian rug, wicker chair, as well as a blank canvas on an easel. The artist's eye, I think, struggled with the fate of painterly skills, which Hamilton himself had honed as a young student in the 1930s, copying paintings at the National Gallery. It struggled with the fate of these skills following Duchamp's invention of the ready-made. This was signaled by the cheeky ironing board, which we can see here, in front of the Rembrandt self-portrait, which riffs on Duchamp's invention of the reciprocal ready-made, which he said you could make by transforming a Rembrandt into an ironing board. In his text for The Artist's Eye, Hamilton readily acknowledged that the ready-made had replaced craft, like pictorial skills, with concepts, what he called gray matter. But throughout his artistic career, he never seemed to fully disentangle these poles. Rather, he seemed to see technical skill and the cerebral operations of imagination and cognition as equal players in what he termed the mind of the artificer. For all his irony, Hamilton sincerely admired, I think, the commitment of painters like Bosch or Van Eyck to the powers of aesthetic imagination, what he called their unmatched achievement in conjuring, by way of manual skill and cognitive dexterity, worlds more real than everyday experience. In The Artist's Eye, we might see then a postmodern take on this technologically equipped imagination, a real space in which all gestures, bodies, images, and objects, the whole long front of culture, in short, were always already figured as figments of the artist's imagination, players on the stage of representation. And in ending my book here, it gestures to our present. Though they are not often cited as such, the IG's exhibition designs must be counted as key origin points for a range of contemporary strategies, from research-based archival practices to curatorial procedures. Artists as disparate as Tacita Dean, Liam Gillick, Martin Beck, Steve McQueen, Camille Enroe, Renee Green, or Hito Steirl have consciously or not furthered the IG's drive, braiding of archival investigation into the history of industry, art, or science, with the drive to model alternative spaces and produce new futures. And many of them have taken the IG's blind spots as their areas of investigation, adopting a post-colonial lens, instituting a critical attention to race and class, or exploring the ways in which globalization developed unevenly in locations outside centers of production. The hope of the book, then, is to bring the IG into a future that they divined, with both exhilaration and foreboding, at the very beginning of the post-war period. Hamilton said it best himself, reflecting anachronistically on a reconstruction of the funhouse, which we know by now. He described the future-directed quality of his original installation, quote, taking off, filled with brash ephemera, to other planets, a cultural spaceship going who knows where. Thank you.
Well, Kevin, that was wonderful. And we thank you for introducing us to your groundbreaking investigation of the IG's invention of the first models of pop art and to the long front of culture. There's so much to absorb here. And I know we have one question in the chat, and that it is from, hold on, let me see if I can get it to come up on my screen. Where is it? Oh no.
Sorry for going over time, by the way.
But it was in the chat to me, and it disappeared. Oh, I'm so, wait a minute, I might be able to get it down here. Hold on. It was sent to me privately, so let's just see. Save the chat, hold on. Huh. How does one retrieve something from the chat? I don't know why it left. It was from Oliver, and it was a fabulous question.
Oh, and Oliver's gone.
And Oliver's gone. He had to leave at 6.
It might be that because he left, it disappeared.
Because he left it, it disappeared. Right. I think that must be what happened, because it was here just a moment ago. So my apologies.
That's okay.
Maybe we can ask people to unmute at this point. Sure. And if you want to just raise your hand, I can, through the reactions, I can call on you. I'm just trying to think. I just need to click on the participants, right, to do that? To see raised hands? Yeah, so let me see if there are any raised hands here.
Oh, there's one coming through. Oh, I see one in the from Mark.
Okay.
Oh, and then also from Hartmut.
Great. Okay. Are they in the chat, or where are they?
Yeah,
Are they
it
coming?
looks like they're to everyone. So Mark asks,
yeah.
Can you speak further about the IG's impact on contemporary practice? Yeah, this is a good point. And also maybe Mark could speak more better than I could to it. It just seems to me that whether or not artists today consciously ground themselves in or know of the IG, that some of the ways of thinking and working and the forms of cross-disciplinary dialogue that they instituted are just absolutely, at least crucial predecessors or ways of thinking about what's happening now, right? Like when we talk about artists taking on the roles of curators, when we talk about artists calling themselves researchers, when we talk about artists more and more engaged with the conditions of display and exhibition making, we have to, in my mind, look back to the independent group as at least the most innovative in the post-war period set of artists to look at exhibition making as a medium in itself, as an aesthetic practice in itself that involves in its essence forms of research, publicity, technology, engineering, so that's the point. It's sort of a hard question to answer specifically because I can't really speak except for artists like Mark Leckey or Martin Beck, who make explicit reference to the IG and Hamilton, or Liam Gillick, who make to Hamilton in particular. It seems like it's more of like an ethos that travels forward because the IG didn't really leave a lot of students in their wake. No direct students, as it were. Although we have people, honestly, it's probably people like Brian Ferry of Roxy Music, for example, who probably take up the IG mantle more than contemporary artists, Brian Ferry was a student of Richard Hamilton's in Newcastle and went on, thanks in part to Hamilton's training, to form Roxy Music. So it's that kind of work that's not necessarily found in contemporary art, but in popular culture at large, that maybe we could seek their legacies there, if that makes sense.
Kevin, what do you think inspired the curators in 2014 to do that large retrospective of Richard Hamilton?
Yeah, I was sort of involved in that exhibition. In part, I helped reconstruct for the first time Growth and Form.
I saw it. It was fabulous.
Yeah, we talked about that, right? Yeah.
Right,
it's a good question. I think in part, the Tate wanted. Well, in part, it's an argument to say, look, we need to shore up as a British institution that we are the founders of pop. On the other hand, it's like I don't know. Maybe they sensed that Hamilton in particular sort of that the diversity of his practice beyond the paintings, right? He's often just known as like the grandfather of pop, and his paintings from that period so crucial for pop painting. But he was arguably more invested in exhibition making than painting. At least, sorry, my cat's entering the realm here. More interested in cross-disciplinary forms like exhibition making than he was in painting or collage. So I think what that exhibition tried to argue, and I know Mark, the curator of the show, we spoke about it at length, and the reason why he wanted to open the show with Growth and Form as the first room you enter is to show like Hamilton is not just pop. He provides a model for cross-disciplinary production beyond painting. And in fact, the 1950s needs to be thought of more as just the decade of abstract expressionism. Sorry, but Bunny likes attention. And more as the decade of cross-disciplinary thought, right? Not the 1960s, but the 50s was the time when media thinking, cross-media thinking and experimentation started. And I really want to bring that kind of, or at least that's how I read the exhibition. I actually don't know if Mark thought that directly. That's how I read it, and that's what I wanted to take forward in the book by bringing it beyond Hamilton and more into the IG, because the 1950s, for me, it's where contemporary art begins. Not the 60s, not the 70s, not the 80s. It's the 50s, where it's not just about painting then, right? And Clement Greenberg and all those great critics. It's also about experimentation and cross-media experimentation. And I think, yeah, so that's maybe why the exhibition mattered at that time. It's interesting to note, though, that exhibition did not travel to the United States,
No.
even though Mark Godfrey, the curator, wanted it to. And it goes to show how British art is still not really legible, maybe, or something in American context. It might also be sort of the MoMA complex, which says pop art starts here in New York, not over there. You know what I mean? So I just think that it's interesting what happened around that exhibition. And I also think that for me, the independent group was global. It was international. They wanted to cross the Atlantic. They wanted to make dialogues to the continent and to the US. And for me, they begin a kind of global way of approaching art history as well. I'm kind of bringing a lot of concepts in here, but that's a good question, Nancy. It's really good.
So I think you have two more in here, one from Hartmut What role, if at all, played Bridget Riley in the group's activities? It looks like some of her designs appear in some of the exhibitions by members.
Love that question, Hartmut. Yeah, Bridget Riley, what a strange and great artist who kind of follows in the wake of the IG. By the way, when I say strange, that's like a high compliment. It's not like, yeah. You're right. She wasn't involved directly. She sort of comes after them. But in many, you're right to see her in those early projects, specifically This Is Tomorrow. I'm sure she saw those, at least in books or in speaking with Hamilton even, or other artists in the IG. And what she probably got from them is that attention to spectatorial disorientation, right? To looking for ways to disorient or disorder the senses of the viewer, right? And so I think that there's a strong connection to be made there. She, however, sticks mainly to painting, right? Whereas the IG is always sort of beyond painting, in my opinion. But Bridget Riley, for me, is a very understudied artist as well, despite her fame. Sort of she's not fully understood, I think, and deserves a lot more attention. And I really like the way that she and the IG seek to really get inside the sensory apparatus of the viewer, you know, to scramble it from inside via optical illusions or what have you. And to me, that's a really generative place for working and thinking. Yeah. Oh, and Stoney has yeah. You know, I've thought a lot about this, Stoney. He's asking, an exhibit, the last exhibition with the perspex looks so much like minimal art. The space divided by simple forms that affect the viewer's physical experience, like literally dividing up the space or reflecting the body back to it. You think of like Donald Judd's surfaces or Robert Morris's mirrored cubes. Did the minimal artists know the IG exhibits? Stoney, I don't think they did. I don't think they knew them. The N exhibit was a pretty like hermetic, unknown project until recently, honestly, and that's a shame. But it, in my opinion, foreshadowed all of those things, you know, and in many ways goes beyond them, in my opinion. But that's a whole other debate. But it's interesting how they didn't even know this, and Hamilton wouldn't have known at this point. It was only till the early 60s. It was in the early 60s when Hamilton met for the first time Warhol, Robert Morris, Rauschenberg, Johns, all those figures that he met for the first time actually visiting a Duchamp, the first Duchamp retrospective in Pasadena. It was only then that he met all these people. So no one knew each other in this, at least these groups didn't know each other, I don't think, at least in the 50s. But it's interesting how like things are in the air, you know what I mean? Like artists can be working with similar ideas and thoughts in complete parallel without knowing. And it happens all the time, doesn't it? You know, like throughout art history, it happens. It's like, you know, like ways of thinking just emerge separately because the conditions are the same in different places, you know? And so it's just interesting to me. I can't tell you that they didn't know. In other words, they didn't, I don't think, but they just seem to be computing things in similar parallel forms. That's all. Yeah.
And Jen Burns also just added something,
right.
A question to the chat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, LeWitt and Dan Graham. Yeah, Dan Graham is like would be probably like the key link, right, between an exhibit and the next generation or the American generation, and LeWitt's grids for sure. The conceptual focus on sort of pre-planned rules of making that take the agency away from the artist, that was already in an exhibit. And it was, as well as the industrial fabricated materials. But you had a question about Family of Man, it looks like.
Yeah, can I just ask it? Because I'm too long-winded to put it in the chat.
Sure.
I'll try to keep it short. So I was thinking right away, even before you mentioned Steichen, about the family of man, and wondering, because I really liked, you had a sort of great formalist moment where you were describing these, what's the word, the apparatus, the adaptive apparatus?
Oh, adaptive appliances.
Adaptive appliances, that's
I love
it.
that,
And
yeah.
I love that. I love that part of the talk, and the way you created a formal argument for how the body of the spectator moves through creating different views and activating sort of different potentials. And
Sure.
I guess I just wondered, given that those adaptive appliances are not so different from what we would see in like a Steichen installation, where typically that exhibition perhaps is misread, but is often seen as sort of promoting this kind of very soft humanism,
Yeah.
in which there, the critical capacity of the viewer to engage those images and what they mean is sort of undermined
Yeah.
by that presentation. It made me wonder, given that the formal strategies aren't so different.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm hoping you might speak to is, maybe that's incorrect. Maybe that formally they do function differently. Maybe that context also plays a role in relationship to the particular formal strategies of the exhibition.
Yeah.
Or are we not really understanding the family of man correctly?
Yeah, it's a good question. And family of man, like, for all, you're right to bring it up, because for all, I guess, anyone who wants to write an art or visual history of the mid-century, family of man is sort of like a key hinge point. And for those of you who don't know it, it's a photographic exhibition, which sort of groups photographs taken from different contexts around what Steichen and others sort of deemed universal human traits or feelings, or social organizations, family, care, I don't know, motherhood or something.
Yeah, it's
basically essentializing humanistic traits that, for many good reasons have been critiqued, and for rightly so, in sort of to institute this kind of family of man, as it were, this great family of man in the face of Cold War fears. We're all human after all, because we all love, we all have a mother, we all have a father, we all suffer, we all love. I think that I think what differentiates them, despite you're right that the formal strategies are similar. Blow up photographs suspended in space, guiding the viewer through them. What's different, though, is I think that the IG is already sort of post-human. You know what I mean? They're already beyond humanism, in my opinion. They're already deprivileging the human as the key subject in the world. They already see machines, appliances, animals, creatures, children, not only adults, as just as privileged, or just as, I would say, as privileged as the human being, or at least deserving of a voice and a say within the public sphere, right? So in my opinion, they're less about shoring up humanist values than about extending the public sphere to these non-human entities, whether it's technological prostheses or creatures of various kinds. Now, we could argue about whether that's a good or a bad thing, but it at least it makes it feel more contemporary, where we're having to think, in a time of climate emergency, frankly, of saving this planet from our own doing, right? Where frankly, human agency has done a lot. Privileging the human hasn't done much for the ecology of the planet, and we need to find ways to bring other creatures into the discussion. I think the IG is beginning that conversation, at least.
Yeah, I
kind
totally
of a reach, but yeah.
I think that's that's fascinating. And the only thing I would just point out is then you're back to an argument more based on the content of the photographs than the actual means of display. And you could, they're not identical. You could certainly argue that what the IG is doing in that on growth and form with the sort of scaffolding that you can move through is perhaps more open-ended than the kind of clustered hanging that is typical of Family of Man. I just want to point out that it's not then strictly about the sort of formal choices for the exhibition display, that those don't, I'm not sure those get to carry quite as much weight as you want them to, even though I'd love it if they did, because it also matters, in other words, the sort of ideology of what is pictured becomes as important.
Right. That's a good point. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Being a diehard formalist, I always perk up at those very formal.
I'm probably a closet formalist myself. Yeah.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think we should let Kevin go and have his dinner and raise a glass to him and congratulate him and thank him for a really wonderful hour and a half. And we hope the book will be an enormous success. And we look forward to your next projects. So
thank you. And sincerely, thank you for staying longer. I really, really appreciate that. I'm sorry I went over. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. And good to see you all. Thanks, Nancy.
Bye-bye. Thanks again.